In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally, and sovereign authority over German territory passed to the Allied powers. In the months that followed, the Allied Control Council established zonal military governments and issued directives that formally dissolved the command structures of the Wehrmacht and outlawed the National Socialist German Workers' Party. While elements of civil administration continued to function under occupation, Germany no longer exercised independent control over its territory or foreign relations. The immediate post-war focus of governments and the public centered on reconstruction, occupation governance, and the prosecution of major war criminals. From late 1946 onward, a less visible development began to take shape alongside these processes: the movement of German nationals out of Europe. This movement included former military officers, party officials, and civilians whose wartime affiliations varied widely. The scale and character of this migration were not immediately apparent. Early knowledge was fragmented and largely confined to diplomatic correspondence, intelligence reporting, immigration files, and a limited body of church and humanitarian documentation. Public awareness developed gradually from the late 1940s and intensified after the conclusion of major war crimes trials, and later through high-profile investigative journalism and declassified intelligence materials in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Argentina would emerge as the most prominently discussed destination in these public and investigative accounts. This prominence reflected both the presence of identifiable former Nazi personnel in the country and the later exposure of individual cases, rather than a comprehensive early understanding of post-war migration patterns. The association between Argentina and former German officials became widely known only after sustained investigation and retrospective analysis. The movement of German nationals to Argentina after the Second World War encompassed distinct categories of individuals. Former Wehrmacht officers, many of whom had not been individually charged with specific war crimes at the time of migration, faced denazification measures, loss of rank, and uncertain economic prospects in occupied Germany. Members of the SS and other Nazi organizations confronted a substantially higher risk of prosecution for crimes against humanity and relied on false identities and concealment to evade arrest. Civilian Nazi officials, including administrators, intelligence personnel, and technical specialists, occupied an intermediate position, often possessing skills that remained in demand during the early Cold War. These distinctions are essential to understanding both the scale and the character of post-war migration. Argentina's role in this process must be understood within its own political and legal framework. The Argentine Republic emerged from the war with its state institutions intact and a government that emphasized national sovereignty and independence from external control. Immigration policy, visa issuance, and extradition were governed primarily by domestic law and executive discretion, despite intermittent diplomatic pressure from allied governments. These conditions did not compel Argentina to accept former German personnel, but they permitted entry and residence in ways that diverged from Allied priorities in occupied Europe. International conditions further shaped these outcomes. The immediate post-war period was marked by mass displacement, administrative overload, and uneven enforcement capacity across Europe. After 1947, as Cold War tensions intensified following developments such as the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, anti-communism increasingly influenced foreign policy priorities. The pursuit of Nazi fugitives outside Europe lost urgency in this changing strategic environment. These shifts altered the context in which accountability was pursued, without altering the legal responsibility attached to wartime crimes. The history examined in this documentary is reconstructed from documented evidence and defined by its limits. It does not proceed from assumptions of hidden coordination or later mythologies. Instead, it traces how identifiable state policies, administrative practices, transnational routes, and geopolitical conditions shaped the post-war movement of German military officers and Nazi officials to Argentina. The archival record is sufficient to explain this phenomenon without embellishment, and it provides a framework for understanding how decisions made between 1945 and the mid-1950s produced consequences that continued to resonate long afterward. In the final year of the Second World War and the immediate period that followed, Europe entered a phase of disruption without modern precedent. By late 1944 and early 1945, the territorial integrity of the German Reich had already collapsed in practice. Allied forces advanced from the west, the Red Army from the east, and the remaining administrative capacity of the Nazi state was consumed by military defeat. Civil registries were destroyed or abandoned, transport networks disintegrated, and population movements accelerated across collapsing front lines. Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender on 7 to 8 May 1945 transferred sovereign authority over German territory to the Allied powers. On June 5, 1945, through the Berlin Declaration, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France assumed supreme authority and divided Germany into 4 occupation zones. Administration was exercised through separate military governments, coordinated imperfectly through the Allied Control Council. In the months that followed, Allied directives formally dissolved the national-level command structures of the Wehrmacht and outlawed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, while allowing limited local administration to continue under occupation supervision. This transition did not produce administrative clarity. Instead, it coincided with the largest displacement crisis in modern European history. By mid-1945, Allied and United Nations estimates placed the number of displaced persons in Europe at more than 11 million. These included former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, refugees fleeing combat zones, and demobilized soldiers attempting to return to civilian life. Germany itself became both a source and a destination for displaced populations, as millions of people moved across and within its occupation zones. Former German soldiers represented a significant portion of this movement. Between 1945 and 1946, several million members of the former Wehrmacht were released from Allied captivity. Many returned to towns and cities that had suffered extensive destruction and faced acute shortages of housing, food, and employment. Documentation was often incomplete. Military records had been destroyed during combat or intentionally dismantled in the final weeks of the war, and personal papers were frequently lost, discarded, or concealed. The administrative systems available to manage this situation were improvised under severe constraints. Allied military governments relied on emergency identification procedures, temporary registration cards, and camp-based records that varied by zone. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, established in 1943 and operational across Europe from 1945, was tasked with humanitarian relief, providing food, shelter, and medical care, and facilitating repatriation. Its mandate did not include systematic investigation of wartime conduct. Priority was given to stabilizing populations and preventing famine and epidemic disease. Identity verification under these conditions was necessarily limited. Many individuals lacked valid civil documents because registries had been destroyed by bombing or because they had fled without papers. German soldiers frequently removed uniforms and insignia as front lines collapsed, blending into civilian populations. Party membership lists, police files, and military personnel records were often incomplete or inaccessible to occupation authorities. These conditions did not alter legal responsibility for wartime crimes, but contemporaneous Allied occupation records indicate that they constrained the capacity for rapid, individualized case reconstruction. Allied screening procedures reflected these realities. In the American and British zones, counterintelligence corps units focused primarily on identifying individuals regarded as immediate security threats, such as suspected intelligence operatives, high-ranking Nazi officials, or persons believed to be organizing resistance to occupation. Denazification programs, formally introduced in late 1945, relied heavily on standardized questionnaires and available documentation. Germans were categorized into broad groups based on self-reporting, witness statements, and limited archival evidence. The system was designed to process millions of cases quickly, not to conduct exhaustive investigations into lower and mid-level personnel. The Soviet zone pursued a different political approach, emphasizing ideological re-education and the removal of perceived class and political enemies, but it faced similar administrative limits. Across all zones, the primary objectives during 1945 and 1946 were restoring order, maintaining basic economic activity, and transferring increasing responsibility to German civil authorities under supervision. War crimes prosecutions focused on a relatively small number of senior figures. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, convened from November 1945 to October 1946, established legal precedents but addressed only a narrow segment of those involved in the Nazi system. As a result, the majority of former Wehrmacht officers and enlisted personnel were not prosecuted for war crimes. Many were interned briefly, questioned, and released. Members of the SS and officials of Nazi organizations were subject to more intensive scrutiny, but enforcement capacity remained uneven, particularly outside major urban centers. By late 1946, Allied authorities increasingly sought administrative efficiency and cost reduction in occupation governance, a trend that would intensify after 1947 as Cold War tensions reshaped strategic priorities. Beyond Germany, the broader European context compounded these challenges. Austria, occupied after May 1945, became a major transit area for populations moving south from Germany and Eastern Europe. Italy, having experienced its own regime collapse in 1943 and subsequent civil conflict, possessed extensive port infrastructure but limited post-war administrative control. Cities such as Rome, Genoa, and Milan hosted large concentrations of displaced persons awaiting documentation, employment, or onward passage. Within these transit zones, pathways for extra-European migration began to form. Allied authorities initially assumed that most displaced persons would be repatriated. For German nationals, however, repatriation meant return to an occupied and economically devastated homeland, continued denazification procedures, and restricted employment opportunities. By late 1946, Increasing numbers sought alternatives beyond Europe, particularly in regions not subject to Allied occupation. International mechanisms for organized resettlement were still developing. The International Refugee Organization, established in December 1946 and operational in 1947, inherited responsibilities from UNRRA. Its mandate emphasized the resettlement of victims of Nazi persecution and stateless persons. German nationals, as citizens of the defeated state, were generally excluded from priority consideration. This exclusion did not prevent movement, but meant that German migrants often traveled outside formal refugee channels. This institutional gap created a paradox. German nationals were not the intended beneficiaries of international resettlement programs, yet the administrative environment allowed significant cross-border movement with limited verification. Individuals able to reconstruct identities, assume new identities, or exploit gaps in documentation could move across borders with relative ease compared to later decades. This applied unevenly across categories. Former Wehrmacht personnel, SS members, and civilian officials faced different degrees of scrutiny depending on rank, visibility, and available records. Passenger manifests preserved in Italian Port Authority records from 1946 and 1947 show a steady flow of immigrants departing for destinations in the Americas, including South America. While many were civilians seeking economic opportunity, these lists also included former soldiers and officials whose wartime affiliations were not systematically examined at embarkation. Shipping companies and port officials operated within the legal frameworks of the time, which did not require comprehensive background investigations. These conditions were not the product of a coordinated effort to facilitate escape. They arose from cumulative factors: military defeat, humanitarian urgency, administrative overload, and the gradual reorientation of international priorities. The systems in place were designed to manage immediate crisis and recovery, not to enforce long-term historical accountability across continents. By the end of 1947, Europe remained a continent in motion. Transport networks had been partially restored, commercial shipping resumed, and borders were more permeable than they would become in later Cold War decades. The combination of displacement, limited verification capacity, and emerging geopolitical shifts created an environment in which departure from Europe was possible for individuals with differing wartime affiliations and post-war circumstances. The structural conditions that enabled departure from Europe after 1945 did not, by themselves, determine destinations. Movement required receiving states whose legal frameworks, institutional cultures, and administrative practices permitted entry and settlement. Argentina occupied such a position not as a result of post-war improvisation, but because of long-standing political, military, and economic relationships with Germany that extended back to the late 19th century and remained operative at the end of the Second World War. From the 1880s onward, Argentina pursued state-led modernization through large-scale European immigration. German-speaking immigrants constituted a significant component of this process. By the early 20th century, tens of thousands of German nationals resided in Argentina, concentrated primarily in Buenos Aires and other major urban centers. German-language schools, churches, professional associations, and commercial chambers were established with state tolerance and, in some cases, official recognition. These institutions were integrated into Argentine's civic and economic life rather than functioning as isolated enclaves. Military cooperation formed one of the most durable dimensions of German-Argentine relations. Beginning in the late 19th century, the Argentine army adopted Prussian and later German models of professional military education. German officers were contracted as instructors, and Argentine officers attended German military academies and staff colleges through exchange arrangements documented in Argentine army training records. German doctrinal texts influenced Argentine military manuals, particularly in artillery, engineering, and staff organization. This influence was technical and institutional, not ideological, reflecting admiration for perceived efficiency and organizational rigor rather than political alignment. These connections persisted after the First World War. Despite Germany's defeat in 1918 and the constraints imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, German military thought continued to circulate internationally. Argentine officers followed developments in German operational doctrine and technological innovation through professional journals, translated manuals, and informal networks. German firms maintained a commercial presence in Argentina, supplying industrial machinery, chemicals, and technical expertise that supported agriculture, transportation, and manufacturing. Economic ties expanded during the interwar period. In the 1920s and 1930s, Germany became one of Argentina's principal trading partners, alongside the United Kingdom and the United States. Bilateral clearing agreements structured trade, exchanging Argentine agricultural exports for German industrial goods. These arrangements deepened institutional familiarity between state agencies, commercial firms, and financial intermediaries in both countries. They also reinforced a perception within Argentine elites that Germany was a technologically advanced partner whose expertise could be utilized independently of broader geopolitical alignments. The rise of the National Socialist regime in Germany in 1933 altered the political context, but did not eliminate these institutional relationships. German cultural and educational organizations abroad were subjected to increased ideological oversight from Berlin, and some German communities in Argentina experienced internal political pressure. The Argentine state, however, did not adopt National Socialism as official ideology and did not subordinate its institutions to German political control. German influence remained strongest in technical, educational, and commercial domains, rather than in state ideology or governance. Within the Argentine military, professional engagement with Germany continued into the late 1930s. German military attaches served in Buenos Aires, and arms procurement from German manufacturers proceeded until the outbreak of the Second World War. Argentine officers studied German rearmament and operational practices with interest, viewing them through the lens of national defense rather than ideological affinity. These activities were documented in military correspondence and procurement records and reflected Argentina's long-standing emphasis on strategic autonomy. When war broke out in Europe in September 1939, Argentina declared neutrality, consistent with its legal tradition and foreign policy practice. Neutrality was maintained through most of the conflict, shaped by economic considerations, domestic political divisions, and resistance to external pressure, particularly from the United States. Argentina severed diplomatic relations with Germany only in January 1944 and declared war in March 1945, shortly before the conflict ended. This delayed alignment preserved institutional continuity within Argentina's diplomatic, military, and administrative apparatus. Unlike states that experienced occupation or direct military defeat, Argentina did not undergo wartime purges or externally imposed restructuring of its institutions. German diplomatic and commercial activities were restricted under international pressure but not eradicated. German nationals continued to reside in Argentina under domestic law, and existing professional networks were disrupted but not dismantled. When the war ended in Europe, Argentina entered the post-war period with its administrative systems intact and staffed by officials whose careers had not been interrupted by defeat or occupation. Juan Domingo Perón emerged from this institutional environment. As a military officer, he had been shaped by traditions that valued European models of state organization and social order. His service as military attaché in Italy between 1939 and 1941 exposed him to authoritarian systems emphasizing corporatism, centralized authority, and social discipline. Although Italy, rather than Germany, exerted the strongest personal influence on Perón, the broader admiration within the Argentine officer corps for continental European models was well established by the early 1940s. The military government that took power in June 1943 pursued policies emphasizing national sovereignty, state-led development, and resistance to external political pressure. During the war, U.S. diplomatic efforts to compel Argentine alignment with the Allied cause met sustained resistance. This posture reinforced a political culture skeptical of foreign intervention in domestic affairs, including judicial or administrative demands originating outside Argentina. By the time Europe collapsed in 1945, these institutional patterns remained largely intact. Immigration policy, visa issuance, and internal security practices in Argentina were governed by pre-war legal frameworks and bureaucratic habits. Officials were accustomed to processing European migrants in large numbers with limited background information. The destruction of European civil registries and military records during the war did not fundamentally alter these practices. It increased their significance. German communities that had existed in Argentina for decades provided additional points of continuity. Schools, churches, businesses, and social organizations offered linguistic and practical support to new arrivals. These institutions predated Nazism and survived its defeat. While some had been subject to ideological pressure during the 1930s and early 1940s, they did not disappear in 1945. German nationals arriving after the war constituted informal networks that facilitated settlement without requiring state sponsorship. These continuities did not amount to collective endorsement of Nazi crimes or an organized effort to shield perpetrators. The Argentine state did not adopt National Socialism, nor did it align itself politically with the defeated regime. What persisted were administrative practices, professional relationships, and a foreign policy tradition that emphasized sovereignty and pragmatism over moral interventionism in international affairs. By 1945 and 1946, these factors shaped Argentina's posture toward European migration. The country continued to define itself as a destination for immigrants, particularly Europeans, and its legal framework reflected that identity. German engineers, technicians, and professionals were evaluated primarily in terms of expertise and potential utility. Former military officers were assessed through familiar professional criteria rather than automatically classified as political liabilities. These evaluations varied across institutions and cases, as reflected in visa issuance practices and employment decisions, and did not constitute a uniform admission policy. This institutional continuity influenced how developments elsewhere were interpreted. War crimes trials and denazification proceedings in Europe were followed in Argentine diplomatic and military circles, but they were viewed through a lens shaped by skepticism toward external judicial authority. The principle that foreign governments or tribunals should dictate domestic administrative decisions found limited acceptance among Argentine elites, particularly within the armed forces. The result was a convergence of post-war European displacement and Argentine institutional receptivity, shaped by long-standing professional and administrative ties. Structural collapse in Europe created conditions for movement. Argentina's historical experience with German migration and cooperation shaped perceptions of acceptability and utility. Together, these factors formed the preconditions for the specific political, legal, and bureaucratic choices that would govern migration in the years that followed as Argentina entered the post-war era under Perón's leadership and the international system moved into a new phase of geopolitical competition. Between the military coup of June 4, 1943 and the consolidation of Juan Domingo Perón's presidency by 1947, Argentina experienced political transformation without institutional rupture. The officers who overthrew the civilian government were not unified around a single ideology, but drew on established currents of nationalism, corporatism, and anti-liberalism already circulating within sectors of the armed forces, including informal groupings such as the Grupo de Oficiales Unidos. Perón's rise from colonel to president unfolded through existing administrative channels, most notably his leadership of the Secretariat of Labor and Social Welfare from late 1943, where he expanded state involvement in labor relations while leaving the core structures of the bureaucracy, judiciary, and security services intact and staffed by career officials whose professional formation predated both the war and his ascent. Throughout the Second World War, Argentina maintained neutrality until severing diplomatic relations with Germany on January 26, 1944, and declaring war on Germany and Japan on March 27, 1945. These steps were taken under sustained U.S. diplomatic and economic pressure, including restrictions on trade, shipping access, and participation in inter-American institutions. They were not accompanied by domestic purges, mass dismissals, or externally imposed restructuring of state institutions, and they were intended primarily to secure Argentina's position in post-war international diplomacy. Unlike European states subjected to occupation or military defeat, Argentina entered the post-war period with its legal and administrative frameworks intact, shaped by continuity rather than by externally imposed reform. Perón's electoral victory in February 1946 and assumption of office in June combined electoral legitimacy with a governing philosophy centered on national sovereignty, political independence, and state-led development. Existing legal frameworks governing immigration, citizenship, and extradition were retained, but executive discretion within those frameworks was exercised expansively through decrees, administrative practice, and ministerial interpretation. There was no statutory requirement to exclude former members of foreign armed forces or political organizations, except where specific domestic security concerns were identified under existing public order and security statutes. Extradition decisions remained discretionary and subject to judicial review, constrained by treaty provisions that excluded political crimes. War crimes as defined by international tribunals were not automatically incorporated into Argentine domestic law or extradition practice. The security services advising the executive were shaped by pre-war traditions that prioritized internal order and counter-subversion. Their assessments focused primarily on political activity within Argentina, while foreign allegations and intelligence reporting were monitored selectively when they intersected with domestic security evaluations. Within this system, German nationals were not treated as a homogeneous category. Former Wehrmacht officers were often assessed for technical expertise and potential utility. SS personnel and identified Nazi Party officials faced greater scrutiny. Contingent on the availability of documentation and the specificity of foreign requests, civilian Nazi officials and technical specialists were evaluated largely through professional and administrative channels. Decisions were taken case by case, frequently at the level of consulates issuing visas or ministries approving residence and employment, reflecting decentralized discretion rather than a centralized policy of admission or exclusion. Beginning in 1946 and formalized through the first five-year plan launched in 1947, Perón's government pursued industrialization and infrastructure expansion as central objectives of state policy. European specialists were actively recruited through ministries responsible for industry, public works, energy, and state enterprises, as well as through consular channels abroad. Recruitment criteria emphasized professional qualifications and perceived utility rather than ideological history, provided no immediate domestic security concerns were identified. German technical education and industrial experience were regarded as assets within this framework, alongside expertise drawn from other European countries. International conditions further shaped the policy environment. Argentina's admission to the United Nations in October 1945 reinforced official claims of sovereign equality and resistance to external judicial authority over domestic administrative decisions. While intelligence services in the United States and Europe tracked the movement of former German officials, sustained diplomatic pressure on Argentina regarding immigration and extradition declined markedly after 1947 as Cold War priorities intensified and strategic attention shifted toward reconstruction in Europe and containment of the Soviet bloc. By the late 1940s, the interaction of these factors produced a distinct administrative and political context. Continuity of institutions ensured that pre-war legal norms guided post-war decisions. Executive discretion allowed flexible application of those norms. Ideological emphasis on sovereignty limited responsiveness to external demands. Economic policy prioritized technical capacity over retrospective judgment. Shifting geopolitical conditions reduced persistent external enforcement. Together, these elements define the environment in which former Wehrmacht officers, SS personnel, and civilian Nazi officials entered and settled in Argentina during the immediate post-war years, shaping outcomes not through a single directive or plan, but through the cumulative operation of established political and administrative practices. The political and institutional framework established by the mid-1940s translated into concrete administrative practice through Argentina's immigration system. The movement of German nationals into the country after the war was not governed by emergency decrees or ad hoc improvisation. These mechanisms defined who could enter, under what documentation, and with what degree of scrutiny, and they explain how migration proceeded without the need for a publicly declared policy directed at former German military personnel or Nazi officials. These laws reflected a national identity built around European immigration and delegated wide discretionary authority to the executive branch. Entry visas were issued primarily through consulates abroad, while residence permits and naturalization were administered domestically by the Direction Nacional de Migraciones and related ministries. The system emphasized administrative discretion rather than categorical exclusion, and it was designed to process large volumes of migrants with limited background verification. After 1945, no new legislation was enacted to specifically restrict the entry of German nationals or former members of foreign armed forces. Nor did Argentina incorporate the legal categories established by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg into its domestic immigration or extradition framework. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and membership in organizations declared criminal under international law did not, by themselves, constitute grounds for exclusion under Argentine statutes. Decisions were instead made within existing legal parameters, informed by executive discretion, consular practice, and assessments by security services. Visa issuance was the first critical point in this process. Argentine consulates in Europe, particularly in Italy, Switzerland, Spain, and later Austria, played a central role in facilitating migration. Consular officials were authorized to issue entry visas based on documentation presented by applicants and on general assessments of admissibility. Background investigations were limited by the availability of records and by the absence of standardized international mechanisms for verifying wartime conduct. In many cases, applicants presented passports or travel documents issued after the war by local authorities, humanitarian organizations, or successor administrations operating under Allied oversight. The collapse of European civil registries during the war, combined with the displacement of millions of people, meant that identity verification often relied on self-declared information and fragmentary documentation. Argentine consulates did not possess independent access to Allied denazification files or comprehensive intelligence databases. Requests for additional verification were possible, but were not routine, particularly for applicants presenting themselves as technicians, professionals, or family migrants. This administrative reality applied unevenly across categories. Former Wehrmacht officers, particularly those of lower or middle rank, were often indistinguishable in documentation from civilian professionals. SS personnel and known party officials faced greater risk if their identities were known or flagged, but this depended on the specificity of foreign intelligence and the accuracy of records. Once visas were issued, entry into Argentina occurred through established ports, primarily Buenos Aires. Immigration officials at points of entry conducted inspections focused on health, documentation, and compliance with visa conditions. There was no systematic procedure for screening entrants for wartime crimes committed abroad. The mandate of immigration inspectors was administrative, not judicial. Unless an individual appeared on a specific list provided by foreign governments or was the subject of an active extradition request, entry was typically permitted. Residence permits were granted under similar principles. Migrants were required to register with local authorities and, in some cases, to demonstrate employment or sponsorship. German nationals often secured employment through private firms, professional networks, or state-sponsored recruitment programs. Engineers, technicians, and skilled workers were absorbed into industrial projects aligned with Perón's development agenda. Former military personnel sometimes found roles in technical, advisory, or commercial capacities unrelated to formal military service. Extradition policy operated on a parallel track. Argentina maintained extradition treaties with several European states, but these agreements were framed around traditional criminal law and excluded political offenses. Requests for extradition required formal diplomatic submission, judicial review, and executive approval. In the immediate post-war years, relatively few extradition requests concerning German nationals in Argentina met these criteria. Many European states were still reconstructing their legal systems and prioritizing domestic trials. Where requests were made, they often lacked the documentation required under Argentine law, particularly when charges were based on international tribunal findings rather than domestic indictments. The absence of automatic enforcement mechanisms was not unique to Argentina. International law in the late 1940s did not provide a comprehensive framework obligating states to extradite individuals accused of war crimes committed elsewhere. The Genocide Convention would not be adopted until 1948, and its implementation into domestic law varied widely. Argentina's legal position reflected a broader global context in which sovereignty and non-intervention remained dominant principles. Administrative discretion was further shaped by institutional fragmentation. Responsibility for immigration, security, foreign relations, and labor recruitment was divided among multiple ministries and agencies. Coordination existed but was not centralized. A visa issued by a consulate might be reviewed by immigration authorities upon arrival and assessed separately by security services for domestic concerns. This fragmentation allowed decisions to proceed without a single authority conducting comprehensive oversight of an individual's background. Within this system, outcomes varied. Some individuals entered under their real names and integrated openly into Argentine society. Others relied on altered identities or incomplete documentation. The system did not systematically distinguish between former Wehrmacht officers, SS personnel, and civilian Nazi officials at the point of entry. Differentiation occurred only when specific information was available or when foreign governments pressed particular cases. This explains how individuals with very different wartime roles could pass through the same administrative channels. Quantitative estimates of German migration during this period reflect these practices. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, several thousand German nationals entered Argentina. The majority were civilians or former Wehrmacht personnel. SS members and high-ranking Nazi officials constituted a smaller subset, numbering in the low hundreds according to later archival research. These figures are approximate, constrained by incomplete records, destroyed files, and the use of false identities, but they align with passenger lists, immigration registries, and subsequent investigative findings. Argentina's willingness to regularize residents over time further reduced visibility. Migrants who initially entered on temporary visas could apply for permanent residence and, eventually, naturalization. The naturalization process required proof of residence, employment, and good conduct within Argentina. It did not involve retrospective investigation of wartime activities abroad unless those activities became the subject of domestic legal proceedings. Over time, this process transformed recent arrivals into legal residents and citizens, complicating later efforts at identification and extradition. International scrutiny of these practices existed, but was limited. Allied intelligence services monitored migration routes and exchanged information about suspected war criminals. However, Enforcement depended on bilateral cooperation and sustained diplomatic engagement. After 1947, as Cold War priorities intensified, such engagement became less consistent. The United States and Western European governments increasingly focused on strategic stability, economic recovery, and intelligence competition with the Soviet bloc. Pursuit of fugitives in Latin America did not command the same level of attention or resources as prosecutions within Europe. It is essential to note that the Argentine immigration system did not operate to conceal or protect perpetrators of war crimes. Its design predated the war and reflected assumptions about migration as an economic and demographic process rather than a security risk. The post-war environment exposed the limitations of this design, but it did not fundamentally alter its operation. Administrative routines continued, shaped by discretion, fragmentation, and legal continuity. The cumulative effect of these practices was significant. They created pathways through which German nationals could enter, reside, and integrate into Argentina with limited scrutiny of their wartime pasts. For former Wehrmacht officers and civilian professionals, this process often unfolded openly. For SS personnel and officials associated with the Nazi regime, it required greater concealment and reliance on gaps in documentation, but the same administrative structures applied. These mechanisms help explain how Argentina became a destination for former German military officers and Nazi officials without recourse to a centralized conspiracy or explicit policy of refuge. Law, bureaucracy, and discretion interacted in ways that permitted outcomes not explicitly intended. The result was a pattern of migration shaped less by ideology than by the operation of established institutions in an altered international context. As the immediate post-war years gave way to the early Cold War, these administrative choices acquired longer-term consequences. Individuals who had entered quietly and regularized their status became more difficult to identify and remove. By the time international attention returned to the issue in the late 1950s, the legal and bureaucratic foundations laid between 1945 and 1952 had already shaped the possibilities for accountability. Understanding these mechanisms is essential for evaluating both the scale of migration and the limits of later efforts to address it. The administrative mechanisms that enabled post-war migration intersected with a broader set of economic and strategic objectives pursued by the Argentine state after 1945. Immigration policy did not operate in isolation. It was embedded within a development strategy that prioritized industrial expansion, technological capacity, and relative autonomy from external economic dependence. These priorities shaped how foreign expertise was identified, evaluated, and incorporated, and they help explain why the presence of former German military officers and Nazi officials was tolerated, regularized, or overlooked in practice without being explicitly endorsed. From the moment Juan Domingo Perón assumed office in June 1946, his government articulated industrialization as a central national objective. The immediate post-war years were marked by favorable external conditions. Accumulated foreign exchange reserves from wartime agricultural exports, reduced European competition, and strong domestic political support for state intervention. These resources were directed toward infrastructure, energy production, transportation, and the expansion of domestic manufacturing. The first five-year plan, formally launched in October 1947, codified policies that were already being implemented through executive action. Industrial policy relied heavily on technical expertise. Argentina lacked sufficient numbers of domestically trained engineers, metallurgists, chemists, and industrial managers to support the scale of transformation envisioned by the government. Universities expanded enrollment, but the production of qualified specialists was a long-term process. In the short term, foreign expertise was regarded as indispensable. European specialists, displaced by war and reconstruction, were viewed as a readily available pool of skills. This assessment was not limited to Germans. Italian, Spanish, French, and Eastern European technicians were also recruited. However, German technical education and industrial experience carried particular weight. German engineering standards, vocational training systems, and industrial management practices were widely regarded within Argentine professional circles as rigorous and effective. These perceptions were rooted in decades of prior engagement and were reinforced by the global reputation of German industry before 1945. Recruitment occurred through multiple channels. Ministries responsible for industry, public works, energy, transportation, and state-owned enterprises identified skill shortages and communicated needs to diplomatic missions abroad. Argentine consulates were instructed to facilitate visas for individuals with relevant qualifications, subject to basic security review. Private firms, including both domestic companies and subsidiaries of foreign corporations, also played a role by sponsoring employees and specialists. In some cases, state agencies coordinated directly with intermediaries in Europe to identify candidates. The criteria applied in these processes were functional rather than political. Applicants were assessed on the basis of education, professional experience, and perceived utility to ongoing projects. Documentation typically consisted of academic credentials, employment histories, and references, all of which were difficult to verify comprehensively in the post-war European context. There was no systematic requirement to investigate wartime activities beyond what was revealed by available records or foreign intelligence alerts. Former German military personnel entered this environment in varied ways. Wehrmacht officers with technical backgrounds in engineering, logistics, communications, or aviation were able to present themselves as professionals rather than as former combatants. Their military experience was often reframed in civilian terms, emphasizing skills transferable to industry or infrastructure. In many cases, this reframing was facilitated by the absence of comprehensive denazification records accessible to Argentine authorities. Civilian officials who had served within the Nazi state apparatus, but whose work involved administration, economics, or technical planning occupied a similar position. Their expertise aligned with the needs of a state expanding its bureaucratic and industrial capacity. Provided they did not attract attention through political activity or foreign requests, they could be absorbed into private firms, consultancies, or state projects without overt difficulty. SS personnel and individuals closely associated with Nazi security or racial policies faced a different set of constraints. Their backgrounds were more likely to attract scrutiny if known, and their professional skills were less easily reframed in civilian terms. As a result, those who entered Argentina often did so under altered identities or by emphasizing technical qualifications unrelated to their wartime roles. Their ability to integrate depended heavily on the success of this concealment and on the absence of targeted foreign interest. The Argentine state did not create special programs aimed specifically at recruiting former German military or Nazi personnel. Recruitment initiatives were broad and nationality blind in formal terms. Nonetheless, the practical effect of these initiatives was to create an environment in which German professionals, including those with compromised pasts, could find opportunities. The emphasis on rapid development and technical capacity reduced incentives to conduct retrospective investigations that might impede recruitment. Quantitative evidence illustrates the scale of these efforts. Between 1946 and the early 1950s, Argentina admitted tens of thousands of European immigrants annually, though only a fraction were Germans. Of the German nationals who arrived during this period, the majority were civilians or former Wehrmacht personnel. Archival estimates suggest that SS members constituted a small minority, numbering in the low hundreds. Civilian officials associated with the Nazi regime were more numerous, but are difficult to quantify precisely due to overlapping professional categories and incomplete records. State-owned enterprises became significant employers of foreign specialists. Organizations such as Yacimientos Petrolíferos Fiscales, the National Railways, and emerging industrial complexes recruited engineers and technicians to modernize operations. Foreign specialists were also involved in hydroelectric projects, steel production, and military-industrial ventures. In these contexts, professional performance and loyalty to Argentine institutions mattered more than prior political affiliations, provided those affiliations did not manifest domestically. Military modernization formed a parallel strand of this development strategy. While Argentina did not integrate former German officers into its armed forces in official capacities, it did draw on foreign expertise in areas such as aeronautics, ballistics, and armaments production. Advisory roles, consultancy arrangements, and private sector employment linked to defense industries allowed knowledge transfer without formal incorporation into the military hierarchy. These arrangements remained largely opaque, governed by administrative discretion and contractual relationships rather than public policy declarations. The international context further shaped these choices. In the immediate post-war years, the Allied powers themselves competed for German technical expertise. The United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France all implemented programs to recruit or compel German scientists, engineers, and technicians for military and industrial purposes. This competition underscored the perceived value of German expertise and weakened the normative force of arguments against its utilization elsewhere. Argentine officials were aware of these developments and viewed their own recruitment efforts as consistent with prevailing international practice. As Cold War tensions intensified after 1947, anti-communism became an increasingly salient consideration. Argentine security services assessed foreign nationals primarily through the lens of domestic political stability. Individuals perceived as politically passive, professionally focused, and aligned with state development goals attracted less attention than those associated with leftist movements or labor agitation. Former German nationals who avoided political activism and complied with administrative requirements were therefore less likely to face obstacles. Over time, the integration of foreign specialists reinforced administrative normalization. Migrants who entered on temporary visas applied for permanent residence and, in some cases, naturalization. Employment records, tax payments, and compliance with local laws established a formal history of good conduct within Argentina. This process further decoupled their legal status from their wartime pasts and reduced the likelihood of future scrutiny absent external intervention. The cumulative effect of these dynamics was not the creation of a sanctuary by design, but the emergence of a permissive environment shaped by development priorities. The Argentine state prioritized economic transformation, technical capacity, and political autonomy. Immigration and recruitment practices were aligned with these goals. Where moral or legal considerations conflicted with perceived national interest, they were often subordinated to administrative pragmatism. This approach carried long-term implications. By facilitating the entry and integration of foreign specialists without systematic investigation of prior conduct, Argentina created conditions in which individuals with widely varying wartime histories could establish durable lives. For former Wehrmacht officers and civilian professionals, this often occurred openly. For SS personnel and high-risk officials, it required concealment but benefited from the same institutional priorities. Understanding this dimension is essential for explaining why post-war migration to Argentina included individuals implicated in Nazi crimes without requiring the assumption of ideological affinity or centralized conspiracy. Developmental imperatives, administrative discretion, and international competition for expertise interacted to shape outcomes. These forces operated alongside, and sometimes in tension with, evolving international norms of accountability. As the early 1950s progressed, these patterns became increasingly entrenched. Projects initiated under the first five-year plan matured, foreign specialists became embedded in professional networks, and administrative regularization reduced visibility. By the time international attention returned more forcefully to the issue of Nazi fugitives in Latin America later in the decade, the structural foundations laid during the immediate post-war years had already constrained the range of possible responses. The administrative openness and development priorities that shaped Argentina's post-war reception of European migrants intersected with a set of transnational movement systems that operated between 1945 and the early 1950s. These systems, often later described collectively as ratlands, did not constitute a single organization or centrally directed conspiracy. They were instead a series of overlapping routes, intermediaries, and procedural gaps that enabled displaced individuals, including former German military officers, SS personnel, and civilian Nazi officials, to move from Central Europe to overseas destinations. Their operation must be understood within the broader context of post-war displacement, humanitarian administration, and fragmented authority. At the end of the war in May 1945, Europe contained an estimated 11 to 12 million displaced persons. These included former forced laborers, prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, refugees fleeing advancing armies, and civilians uprooted by border changes. The Allied powers confronted an unprecedented logistical challenge. Responsibility for managing displaced persons initially fell to the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, established in 1943, and later to the International Refugee Organization, IBRO, created in December 1946 and operational from mid-1947. Their primary mandates were humanitarian, repatriation, basic sustenance, and resettlement of those unwilling or unable to return home. Within this environment, documentation was scarce and uneven. Civil registries in Germany, Austria, Poland, and parts of Italy had been destroyed or rendered inaccessible. Millions of people lacked valid passports or identity papers. Allied military governments issued temporary documents, and displaced persons camps operated based on self-declared identities supplemented by limited verification. Screening focused on immediate security risks within camps and on eligibility for repatriation or resettlement, not on a comprehensive investigation of wartime conduct beyond high-profile categories. Movement from Central Europe to Southern Europe followed established displacement corridors. Italy emerged as a key transit zone. By 1945 to 1946, it hosted large numbers of displaced persons under Allied control, particularly in the American and British occupation zones. Ports such as Genoa, Naples, and later Trieste became focal points for overseas migration. Italy's geographic position, damaged infrastructure, and administrative overload created opportunities for onward movement that were not present in more tightly controlled northern ports. Travel documents played a central role in this process. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, operating under humanitarian mandates, issued temporary travel documents, often referred to as Red Cross passports or laissez-passer, to stateless persons and those lacking national documentation. These documents were not passports in the legal sense. They certified identity as declared by the bearer and were intended to facilitate travel to a receiving country that had already agreed to admit the individual. Verification of identity was limited by design, as the ICRC lacked police authority and relied on the cooperation of states. These documents became one of several instruments used by migrants seeking to leave Europe. Their issuance did not imply endorsement of the bearer's past actions, nor were they intended to shield war criminals. However, in practice, they could be obtained by individuals who concealed or falsified aspects of their identity, particularly in cases where no contradictory records were available. This vulnerability was a byproduct of humanitarian urgency rather than deliberate collusion. Non-state intermediaries also played roles of varying significance. Certain clergy, operating primarily in Italy and Austria, assisted displaced Germans with shelter, contacts, and documentation. The most frequently cited example is Bishop Alois Hudel, rector of the German-speaking Church of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome. Hudel openly expressed sympathy for German prisoners and, in some cases, assisted individuals later identified as Nazi fugitives. His actions were personal and ideological rather than institutional, and they were not representative of the Catholic Church as a whole. Other clergy provided aid without knowledge of their beneficiaries' pasts, consistent with humanitarian practice. Smuggling networks, forged documents, and private facilitators also existed, though their scale and organization varied widely. Some individuals paid intermediaries to obtain papers, arrange transport, or provide guidance through bureaucratic procedures. These activities exploited administrative gaps rather than relying on centralized coordination. There is no evidence of a single organization directing the movement of Nazi fugitives from Europe to Argentina or elsewhere in Latin America. Instead, multiple actors operated independently, sometimes intersecting by chance. The role of state authorities in Europe was shaped by competing priorities. Allied military governments were primarily concerned with demobilization, reconstruction, and the emerging geopolitical divide. Intelligence services monitored suspected war criminals and exchanged information, but resources were finite. High-profile figures were targeted for arrest and prosecution, while lower-ranking individuals often passed through the system unnoticed, particularly if they avoided attention and did not fall within priority categories. The distinction between categories of German nationals mattered at this stage. Former Wehrmacht officers, unless implicated in specific crimes, were often treated as ordinary displaced persons. Many were released from captivity between 1945 and 1947 and entered civilian life with limited oversight. Their movement through displacement systems did not automatically trigger suspicion. Civilian officials associated with the Nazi state, but lacking a clear criminal profile, occupied a similar position. SS personnel faced higher risks. The SS had been declared a criminal organization at Nuremberg, and membership alone could constitute grounds for arrest. As a result, individuals with SS backgrounds were more likely to conceal their identities, avoid official channels, or rely on intermediaries willing to assist them. Their successful passage through displacement systems depended on the absence of reliable records linking them to their wartime roles and on their ability to present themselves as civilians or former Wehrmacht personnel. Once travel documents were obtained and a destination secured, maritime transport became the final stage. Shipping companies resumed transatlantic service gradually after the war. Argentina, maintaining an active immigration policy, authorized entry visas that could be presented at European ports. Passenger manifests from ships arriving in Buenos Aires in the late 1940s include large numbers of European migrants traveling under temporary documents. Verification at the point of departure and arrival focused on compliance with visa requirements and health regulations, not on retrospective investigation. Spain also functioned as a secondary transit point for some migrants. Under Francisco Franco, Spain maintained an authoritarian regime sympathetic to certain elements of the defeated Axis powers, though it was not formally allied with Germany at war's end. Spanish ports and consular services were used by some individuals seeking onward passage to Latin America. As with Italy, this reflected a permissive administrative environment rather than an organized program of protection. Quantifying the use of these routes is difficult. Estimates based on shipping records, immigration files, and later investigations suggest that several thousand German nationals reached Argentina via Italian and Spanish ports between 1946 and the early 1950s. Among them were former Wehrmacht officers and civilians traveling openly, as well as SS personnel and Nazi officials using false identities. The latter group constituted a minority, but their presence would later attract disproportionate attention due to the gravity of their crimes. It is essential to distinguish between facilitation and intent. The movement systems that enabled migration were products of post-war chaos, humanitarian imperatives, and administrative fragmentation. They were not designed to rescue perpetrators of genocide or crimes against humanity. However, their structural limitations created opportunities for such individuals to escape accountability. Responsibility for this outcome was diffuse, shared across multiple institutions and states operating under constrained conditions. By the early 1950s, many of these routes had narrowed. The IRO intensified screening procedures, European states re-established civil registries, and intelligence cooperation improved modestly. At the same time, the number of displaced persons declined as repatriation and resettlement progressed. Those who had already left Europe, however, were beyond the immediate reach of these changes. The existence of these transnational routes explains how individuals who later became symbols of impunity were able to leave Europe without encountering effective barriers. It does not, by itself, explain why Argentina admitted them or how they were received after arrival. Those questions depended on domestic law, administrative discretion, and development priorities already described. The routes provided the means. National policies determined the ends. Understanding these mechanisms requires resisting simplification. The post-war movement of German nationals was neither a secret escape plan orchestrated from above nor a purely accidental drift. It was the outcome of intersecting systems responding to unprecedented disruption. Humanitarian organizations acted to alleviate suffering. States acted to restore order and pursue their interests. Individuals acted to secure survival and opportunity. Within this complex environment, accountability for wartime crimes became uneven, delayed, and in some cases unattainable. As the early Cold War solidified, attention shifted away from displacement management toward strategic competition. By the time international focus returned to the presence of Nazi fugitives in Latin America later in the decade, the routes that had enabled their departure were largely closed, and the individuals concerned had already embedded themselves within new legal and social contexts. The legacy of these transnational pathways would shape debates about justice, sovereignty, and responsibility for decades to come. The transnational routes that enabled post-war movement did not function solely through state institutions. They were sustained by a dense layer of non-state intermediaries whose activities operated within, alongside, and sometimes at the margins of official humanitarian and administrative systems. These actors did not constitute a unified network, nor did they share a common purpose. Their involvement reflected the structural limits of post-war governance, the ethical imperatives of humanitarian relief, and the uneven distribution of information in a continent still emerging from collapse. Humanitarian organizations formed the most visible non-state presence in post-war Europe. The International Committee of the Red Cross occupied a central role, particularly in the issuance of temporary travel documents to stateless persons and displaced individuals lacking valid national papers. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, the ICRC issued hundreds of thousands of such documents across Europe. These papers were designed to facilitate legal travel once a receiving state had agreed to admit the holder. They were not passports, did not confer nationality, and did not certify the bearer's wartime conduct. Identity was established largely through self-declaration, supported where possible by fragmentary records or witness statements. The humanitarian rationale behind this system was explicit. The scale of displacement and the destruction of civil registries made comprehensive verification impracticable. The ICRC lacked police authority and investigative capacity, and its mandate emphasized neutrality and relief rather than law enforcement. This institutional design, while indispensable for the resettlement of genuine refugees, created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by individuals seeking to conceal past affiliations. These vulnerabilities were structural rather than intentional and were recognized by humanitarian officials at the time as unavoidable under prevailing conditions. The International Refugee Organization, operational from mid-1947, introduced more formal screening procedures for those seeking resettlement under its auspices. Eligibility criteria excluded individuals who had assisted the enemy in persecuting civilians. In practice, however, enforcement depended on documentation and intelligence that were often incomplete or inaccessible. The IRO processed millions of cases under significant time pressure, and its screening mechanisms were unevenly applied across regions and categories. Individuals who did not enter resettlement programs or who secured visas independently through national consulates fell outside its direct oversight. Alongside humanitarian agencies, religious institutions, and individual clergy played varied roles. The majority of religious assistance to displaced persons involved shelter, food, pastoral care, and basic guidance through unfamiliar bureaucratic environments. In most cases, this aid was extended without inquiry into political or military pasts, consistent with humanitarian norms. However, a small number of clerical figures became involved in more active facilitation of migration for German nationals, including individuals later identified as Nazi fugitives. Bishop Alois Hudel remains the most documented example. As rector of the German-speaking church and seminary of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, Hudel occupied a position that placed him in contact with German-speaking displaced persons in Italy. His writings and correspondence indicate ideological sympathy for German prisoners and opposition to what he regarded as collective punishment. From 1945 onward, he assisted certain individuals in obtaining shelter, documentation, and contacts for onward travel. Hudel acted independently, without authorization from the Vatican or coordination with broader church structures. His activities were known to some allied and ecclesiastical authorities, but were not representative of institutional policy. Other clergy assisted displaced persons without knowledge of their beneficiaries' pasts. Monasteries, convents, and church-affiliated charities offered temporary refuge to large numbers of refugees of diverse backgrounds. Given the volume of displacement and the absence of centralized records, such assistance did not involve systematic screening. The presence of some individuals with criminal pasts among these populations was a consequence of scale and opacity rather than targeted protection. Private intermediaries also emerged in this environment. Some operated as guides, translators, or brokers, helping migrants navigate bureaucratic requirements, secure housing, or arrange transport. Others engaged in document forgery or smuggling for payment. These activities were illegal under most jurisdictions, but varied in sophistication and reach. They were not confined to aiding former Nazis. They served a broader market of displaced persons seeking to circumvent administrative delays or restrictions. Evidence suggests that such intermediaries operated opportunistically rather than as part of a coordinated ideological project. The distinction between facilitation and intent is critical. Non-state actors did not possess the authority to grant entry into receiving countries. Their assistance could only be effective if state institutions, consulates, immigration authorities, and port officials accepted the documentation presented. In this sense, non-state facilitation exploited existing administrative discretion rather than replacing it. The responsibility for admission ultimately rested with states, even when non-state actors eased the process. The interaction between humanitarian imperatives and security concerns was a persistent source of tension. Allied authorities were aware that some perpetrators of war crimes might attempt to hide among displaced populations. Screening measures were implemented, including questionnaires, background checks, and the circulation of wanted lists. These measures were effective against individuals already identified by name or rank. They were less effective against those of lower profile or those who altered their identities. The scale of displacement limited the feasibility of exhaustive investigation. Differences among categories of German nationals remained salient at this stage. Former Wehrmacht personnel, particularly those released from captivity and not accused of specific crimes, were often treated as ordinary civilians. Civilian officials who had worked within the Nazi state, but whose roles were administrative or technical, similarly attracted limited attention unless implicated by specific evidence. SS personnel faced the greatest risk, as membership in the organization had been declared criminal by the International Military Tribunal. This risk drove greater reliance on concealment and non-state assistance among that group. Geographic variation also mattered. Displaced persons camps in Italy and Austria differed in oversight, resources, and proximity to ports. Camps under American administration often processed large populations with limited staff, while British-administered camps followed different procedures. Movement between camps and across borders occurred with varying degrees of control. These variations created uneven enforcement and opportunities for evasion. Argentina's role in this context was indirect but consequential. Argentine consulates required evidence of admissibility, but they relied on the documentation presented and did not independently investigate wartime conduct. When visas were issued, humanitarian organizations facilitated travel, and shipping companies transported passengers whose papers met formal requirements. At no point did humanitarian intermediaries substitute for Argentine state authority. They operated within the space created by it. Quantitative assessment of non-state facilitation is constrained by the same factors that limited oversight at the time. Records of ICRC document issuance do not specify the ultimate destinations or later identities of all recipients. Church archives vary in accessibility and completeness. Post-war intelligence files provide partial reconstructions of individual cases, but not a comprehensive mapping of networks. Scholarly consensus holds that while non-state actors played a necessary enabling role for some fugitives, they did not account for the majority of post-war German migration to Argentina, which proceeded through legal channels and ordinary administrative processes. The visibility of non-state intermediaries in later narratives reflects the prominence of individual cases rather than the typical pattern. High-profile fugitives who relied on clerical assistance or false papers attracted attention precisely because their cases were exceptional. The broader flow of migrants, former soldiers, professionals, and families moved through the same humanitarian landscape without attracting scrutiny. As Europe stabilized and displacement declined in the early 1950s, the influence of non-state intermediaries diminished. Civil registries were rebuilt, travel documentation normalized, and humanitarian agencies reduced operations. The window during which humanitarian gaps could be exploited narrowed. Those who had already departed Europe, however, had done so during a period when moral urgency, administrative overload, and legal ambiguity intersected. The legacy of this period lies not in the existence of clandestine networks, but in the exposure of limits inherent in post-war governance. Humanitarian institutions were designed to alleviate suffering, not to adjudicate guilt. Religious actors acted according to conscience and capacity, not investigative mandate. Private intermediaries exploited demand within fragmented systems. States retained formal authority, but exercised it unevenly under competing priorities. These dynamics complicate retrospective judgments. They demonstrate how individuals implicated in severe crimes could escape immediate accountability without requiring systematic protection by humanitarian or religious institutions. They also underscore that the pathways enabling such escapes were the same pathways that allowed millions of displaced persons to rebuild their lives. By the time international attention refocused on accountability later in the decade, The humanitarian phase of post-war migration had largely concluded. Non-state intermediaries had receded from prominence, and the administrative choices made by receiving states assumed greater significance. The consequences of humanitarian gaps were already embedded in new national contexts, shaping the limits of what could later be undone. The movement of German nationals into Argentina after the war cannot be explained solely by humanitarian gaps or transnational routes. Entry, residence, and integration ultimately depended on decisions taken within Argentine state institutions. The documentary record shows neither a single directive to shelter fugitives nor a posture of ignorance. What emerges instead is a pattern of awareness managed through administrative discretion, legal formalism, and fragmented authority. State facilitation occurred not as a clandestine program, but as the cumulative outcome of routine decisions taken across consular, immigration, security, and judicial bodies between 1946 and the mid-1950s. Argentine consulates constituted the first institutional interface. After 1945, consular posts in Italy, Spain, Switzerland, and later Austria processed a growing volume of visa applications from European nationals seeking permanent or temporary entry. Consular instructions emphasized admissibility under domestic law, documentation sufficiency, and alignment with labor or family criteria. There was no standardized requirement to consult Allied denazification files, nor did consulates possess systematic access to intelligence holdings maintained by foreign governments. Where lists of wanted individuals were provided through diplomatic channels, they were treated as case-specific alerts rather than as grounds for categorical exclusion. Visa issuance, therefore, reflected a combination of legal permissibility and practical constraint. Applicants presenting valid travel documents, national passports reissued by successor authorities, Red Cross laissez-passer, or provisional papers, were assessed primarily on formal criteria. Consular correspondence from the period indicates awareness that documentation was often incomplete or recently issued, but this was treated as a general post-war condition rather than as presumptive evidence of criminality. Requests for additional verification were discretionary and unevenly applied, more likely when an applicant's background raised specific concerns or when foreign governments pressed individual cases. Upon arrival in Argentina, immigration officials at ports of entry conducted inspections focused on health, documentation, and compliance with visa terms. The Dirección Nacional de Migraciones operated under statutes that emphasized administrative regularity rather than investigative review of foreign conduct. Unless an individual was named in an active extradition request or flagged through diplomatic channels, entry was generally authorized. This applied across categories. Former Wehrmacht officers entering under their real names and presenting civilian credentials encountered few obstacles. Civilian officials associated with the Nazi state but lacking public notoriety were processed similarly. SS personnel faced a higher risk only when their identities were known or when documentary inconsistencies prompted further inquiry. Residence regularization followed established procedures. Migrants registered with local authorities, obtained identity cards, and secured employment. Argentine law permitted conversion from temporary to permanent residence after a defined period, contingent on employment, tax compliance, and absence of domestic criminal charges. Wartime activities abroad were not part of the routine review. Over time, this process normalized legal status and reduced the visibility of recent arrivals within administrative systems. Security services occupied an advisory rather than a determinative role. Military intelligence and federal police monitored foreign nationals for domestic political activity, with particular attention to communist organizations and labor agitation. German nationals who avoided political engagement and complied with regulations attracted limited scrutiny. Intelligence files from the late 1940s indicate that foreign accusations were noted but rarely pursued, absent corroborating evidence or diplomatic insistence. This orientation reflected institutional priorities established before the war and reinforced during the early Cold War. Extradition practice illustrates the limits of state facilitation and the boundaries of discretion. Argentina maintained extradition treaties with several European states, but these instruments required formal charges under the requesting state's law, judicial review by Argentine courts, and executive approval. Political offenses were excluded, and the applicability of international tribunal judgments was contested. In the immediate post-war years, relatively few requests concerning German nationals in Argentina met these requirements. Some requests were delayed, incomplete, or framed in terms incompatible with domestic legal standards. Where cases proceeded, outcomes varied, reflecting judicial independence and executive calculation rather than automatic refusal. Diplomatic correspondence shows that Argentine officials were aware of international concern regarding Nazi fugitives. Awareness did not translate into systematic exclusion or expulsion. Instead, officials emphasized sovereignty, legal process, and evidentiary sufficiency. This posture was consistent across administrations during the late 1940s and early 1950s and aligned with Argentina's broader resistance to external intervention in domestic affairs. Admission to the United Nations in October 1945 reinforced this stance by situating Argentina within a framework of formal equality among states. State facilitation was also shaped by institutional fragmentation. Consulates, immigration authorities, security services, and courts operated under distinct mandates. Information sharing was limited and often informal. A visa granted abroad did not automatically trigger security review at entry, nor did immigration registration necessarily prompt retrospective investigation. This fragmentation allowed individuals to pass through successive stages without comprehensive background reconstruction. It also diffused responsibility, making outcomes the product of process rather than policy. Quantitative evidence underscores the scale and character of these practices. Immigration records indicate that several thousand German nationals entered Argentina between 1945 and the early 1950s. The majority were civilians or former Wehrmacht personnel. Later archival research and investigative journalism identified SS members and high-ranking Nazi officials among them, numbering in the low hundreds. These figures are constrained by incomplete records, destroyed files, and the use of false identities, but they are consistent across multiple sources. The small proportion of high-profile perpetrators did not alter the routine handling of the broader migrant population. Naturalization further entrenched outcomes. Argentine law permitted foreign residents to apply for citizenship after a period of residence and demonstrated integration. Naturalization proceedings examined conduct within Argentina, language proficiency, and economic stability. They did not entail systematic inquiry into wartime actions abroad unless those actions had already become the subject of domestic proceedings. Successful applicants acquired full legal status. complicating later efforts at identification and extradition. International pressure fluctuated. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied governments prioritized prosecutions within Europe and the reconstruction of legal systems. Intelligence monitoring of Latin America existed but lacked sustained enforcement mechanisms. After 1947, as Cold War tensions intensified, strategic considerations reduced the priority assigned to pursuing fugitives overseas. Diplomatic engagement on the issue became episodic, often focused on individual cases rather than systemic change. It is essential to distinguish facilitation from intent. Argentine state institutions did not declare a policy of refuge for former Nazis, nor did they establish specialized programs to protect perpetrators. Facilitation occurred through the application of existing law in a context of administrative discretion, institutional continuity, and shifting international priorities. Awareness of potential abuses coexisted with a reluctance to expand investigative mandates or subordinate domestic procedure to external demands. This pattern explains apparent contradictions in the historical record. The same state that admitted German professionals and regularized their status later cooperated selectively in investigations and arrests when cases became politically unavoidable. The variability reflects a system responsive to pressure but not oriented toward proactive enforcement. It also reflects the limits of mid-20th century international law, which provided few mechanisms to compel uniform action across sovereign states. By the early 1950s, the consequences of these practices were largely fixed. Individuals who had entered, established residence, and in some cases acquired citizenship were embedded within Argentine society. Administrative files treated them as ordinary residents. Subsequent efforts to identify and prosecute fugitives confronted legal, evidentiary, and political barriers rooted in decisions taken years earlier. The Argentine record, therefore, shows neither ignorance nor conspiracy. It shows a state that applied its laws as written, exercised discretion as permitted, and prioritized sovereignty and development within an international environment that did not impose consistent obligations. Facilitation was real, but it was procedural rather than ideological. It arose from what institutions did, not from what they declared. Understanding this distinction is essential for assessing responsibility, scale, and the limits of accountability in the post-war migration of German military officers and Nazi officials to Argentina. The administrative practices and institutional choices that shaped Argentina's post-war response did not affect all German nationals in the same way. Outcomes varied according to legal exposure, professional profile, and the degree to which an individual's wartime role attracted international attention. To understand how migration unfolded between 1945 and the early 1950s, it is necessary to distinguish among three analytically distinct categories: former Wehrmacht officers, SS personnel, and civilian Nazi officials. Each group faced different constraints, calculated risk differently, and interacted with Argentine and international institutions in distinct ways. Former Wehrmacht officers constituted the largest identifiable category of German military migrants to Argentina in the immediate post-war period. By mid-1946, millions of German soldiers had been demobilized from Allied captivity. Denazification procedures varied by occupation zone, but the majority of Wehrmacht personnel were classified as followers rather than as active perpetrators, unless implicated in specific crimes. For officers below the highest command levels, legal exposure was generally limited, particularly as Allied priorities shifted toward reconstruction and stability. These conditions shaped decision-making. Many former Wehrmacht officers confronted economic dislocation, professional exclusion, and social uncertainty in post-war Germany. The dismantling of military institutions eliminated established career paths, while denazification restricted access to public employment. For those with technical training in engineering, logistics, communications, or aviation, immigration offered an alternative route to professional rehabilitation. Argentina appeared viable because it recognized foreign credentials, sought technical expertise, and did not impose categorical exclusions based on military service alone. In practical terms, many former Wehrmacht officers migrated under their real names. They presented civilian occupational profiles and relied on standard documentation issued by post-war authorities or humanitarian organizations. Their legal risk at departure was comparatively low, and their movement through consular and immigration channels rarely triggered scrutiny beyond routine administrative checks. Upon arrival, they entered civilian employment, often in industry, transportation, or commercial enterprises, and integrated without overt concealment. Civilian Nazi officials occupied a more ambiguous position. This category encompassed a wide range of roles, including administrators, economic planners, intelligence operatives, and professionals whose careers had unfolded within the Nazi state. Unlike SS personnel, civilian officials were not members of an organization declared criminal by the International Military Tribunal. Their legal exposure depended on the nature of their duties and the availability of evidence linking them to crimes. Many faced no immediate charges in the chaotic aftermath of the war. For such individuals, risk assessment involved evaluating the likelihood of investigation rather than the certainty of prosecution. Those whose work had been technical or bureaucratic often perceived their exposure as limited, particularly as denazification mechanisms weakened after 1947. Migration strategies reflected this assessment. Some departed openly, using legitimate documentation and professional references. Others adopted partial concealment, omitting political affiliations while emphasizing technical qualifications. Argentina's administrative environment proved accommodating to this group. Civilian officials with expertise in economics, engineering, or administration aligned with state development priorities and private sector demand. Provided they avoided political activism and complied with local regulations, they attracted little attention from security services focused on domestic order. Over time, regularization of residence and employment further reduced visibility, placing them within ordinary administrative categories. SS personnel confronted the highest level of legal risk. The SS had been declared a criminal organization in October 1946 by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Membership alone constituted grounds for arrest, regardless of individual rank or function. Many SS members were detained in Allied camps, and high-profile figures were actively sought for prosecution. For this group, remaining in Europe entailed significant danger, particularly as investigations continued into the late 1940s. As a result, migration strategies for SS personnel differed markedly. Departure often required concealment, false identities, or reliance on intermediaries. Documentation was altered or obtained under assumed names. Movement through displacement systems avoided official scrutiny where possible. Transit through Italy or Spain provided access to ports and consulates where administrative overload and fragmented oversight created opportunities. Even so, successful departure was uneven and contingent on chance as much as planning. Once in Argentina, SS personnel faced ongoing constraints. Their integration depended on maintaining concealment and avoiding any activity that might attract attention. Employment was often secured through private contacts or marginal sectors rather than through state recruitment programs. Legal status was regularized cautiously, and naturalization, when pursued, occurred only after extended residence. The risk of later exposure persisted, as demonstrated by arrests and extraditions in subsequent decades. These differing trajectories underscore the importance of category-specific analysis. The presence of former German nationals in Argentina after the war cannot be understood as a uniform phenomenon. For the majority, former soldiers without specific accusations and civilian professionals, migration resembled broader European immigration patterns. For a minority, SS personnel and individuals implicated in crimes required the exploitation of administrative gaps and concealment within larger flows. Quantitative estimates support this differentiation. Immigration records and later archival research indicate that several thousand German nationals entered Argentina between 1945 and the early 1950s. The majority were civilians and former Wehrmacht personnel. SS members and high-ranking Nazi officials constituted a small fraction, commonly estimated in the low hundreds. While these individuals would later dominate public narratives, they did not define the overall character of migration at the time. Risk calculations were influenced by evolving international conditions. In the immediate post-war years, Allied enforcement efforts focused on major war crimes trials and on stabilizing Europe. As Cold War tensions intensified after 1947, priorities shifted toward geopolitical alignment and intelligence competition. This shift reduced the likelihood that lower-profile individuals would be pursued aggressively, reinforcing perceptions that immigration could provide long-term security. Argentine institutions did not evaluate these risks directly. They processed applications based on domestic law and available information. Differentiation among categories occurred indirectly through the presence or absence of foreign alerts, documentation inconsistencies, or diplomatic pressure. Where specific cases attracted international attention, responses varied. Some individuals were denied entry, monitored, or later arrested. Others passed through unnoticed and integrated fully. The consequences of these divergent paths became apparent over time. Former Wehrmacht officers and civilian professionals established stable careers and families. Their identities became embedded in administrative records as residents and, in some cases, citizens. SS personnel lived with greater insecurity, maintaining low profiles and relying on concealment. When international focus returned to the issue of Nazi fugitives in the late 1950s and 1960s, it was this latter group that came under scrutiny, often revealing the limitations of earlier enforcement. Understanding these distinctions clarifies the relationship between state facilitation and individual agency. Argentine administrative practices created permissive conditions, but individuals navigated those conditions differently based on their circumstances. Choices about documentation, disclosure, and destination reflected assessments of risk shaped by legal status, wartime role, and international attention. This analysis also reframes responsibility. The migration of former German nationals to Argentina was not driven by a single motive or policy. It resulted from the interaction of structural conditions, institutional practices, and individual decisions. For most migrants, the process aligned with ordinary patterns of post-war movement. For a smaller subset, it represented an escape from accountability enabled by the same systems designed to manage displacement and reconstruction. By distinguishing among Wehrmacht officers, SS personnel, and civilian Nazi officials, the historical record resists simplification. It shows how different categories experienced the same administrative environment in different ways, producing outcomes that ranged from unremarkable integration to prolonged concealment. This differentiation is essential for understanding both the scale of migration and the uneven distribution of accountability that followed. The differentiated trajectories of German nationals in Argentina after the war unfolded within an international environment that was itself undergoing rapid transformation. Between 1947 and the mid-1950s, the emergence of the Cold War reordered priorities among the former Allied powers and reshaped the mechanisms through which accountability for Nazi crimes was pursued. This shift did not erase legal responsibility or invalidate earlier judgments, but it altered the intensity, scope, and geography of enforcement. The consequences of this reordering were decisive for individuals who had already left Europe and established residence abroad. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied policies centered on demilitarization, denazification, and the prosecution of major war criminals. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg concluded its main proceedings in October 1946, followed by subsequent trials conducted by occupying powers, particularly in the American zone of Germany. These efforts focused on senior political leaders, military commanders, and individuals directly implicated in crimes against humanity. The resources devoted to prosecution were finite, and attention was concentrated within Europe, where evidence, witnesses, and jurisdiction were accessible. By 1947, strategic priorities began to change. The Truman Doctrine, announced in March, and the Marshall Plan, launched in June, signaled a shift toward economic reconstruction and political stabilization in Western Europe as bulwarks against Soviet influence. West Germany emerged as a central concern. Its economic recovery and political integration were increasingly viewed as essential to Western security. In this context, extensive denazification came to be seen by many policymakers as a potential obstacle to stability rather than a prerequisite for it. This recalibration affected enforcement practices. Denazification tribunals were scaled back, amnesties were issued, and many former Nazis were reintegrated into public and private life within Germany. Intelligence agencies redirected attention toward monitoring communist activity and recruiting assets with expertise on Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The pursuit of lower-profile Nazi fugitives abroad did not disappear, but it lost institutional momentum. These developments had direct implications for Latin America. Intelligence services in the United States and Western Europe maintained awareness that former Nazi officials had settled in countries such as Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Reports were compiled, names circulated, and files maintained. However, translating intelligence into enforcement required sustained diplomatic engagement and legal cooperation, which competed with other priorities. In many cases, action was deferred unless an individual attracted public attention or became politically salient. Argentina's position within this shifting landscape was distinctive. Its relationship with the United States remained tense through the late 1940s, marked by disputes over trade, diplomacy, and ideology. At the same time, Argentina was not aligned with the Soviet bloc and pursued an independent foreign policy. This posture reduced incentives for sustained pressure over extradition or immigration practices, particularly as Washington sought to consolidate alliances elsewhere. The absence of binding international legal mechanisms further constrained enforcement. While the Genocide Convention was adopted by the United Nations in December 1948, its implementation into domestic law varied, and it did not retroactively create universal jurisdiction for wartime crimes. Extradition continued to depend on bilateral treaties, domestic statutes, and judicial interpretation. States retained wide discretion in responding to requests, and political considerations shaped outcomes. For former Wehrmacht officers and civilian officials residing in Argentina, this environment reinforced the sense that immigration had secured long-term stability. Few faced an active pursuit. Their integration into economic and social life proceeded with minimal interruption. For SS personnel and individuals implicated in specific crimes, risk persisted, but it became more uneven. Some remained under surveillance without immediate consequence. Others were exposed only years later, often through investigative journalism or the efforts of non-governmental actors. Notable cases illustrate these dynamics. Adolf Eichmann, a former SS officer central to the administration of the Holocaust, entered Argentina in 1950 under an assumed identity. His presence went largely unnoticed by authorities until his capture by Israeli agents in 1960. Joseph Mengele, an SS physician associated with atrocities at Auschwitz, also resided in Argentina and neighboring countries before evading capture. These cases were exceptional in severity but emblematic of the broader pattern. Individuals of high culpability could remain undetected for extended periods due to the convergence of administrative normalization and reduced international focus. It is important to emphasize that these outcomes were not the result of a deliberate policy shift to protect perpetrators. They reflected the cumulative effect of changing priorities across multiple states. As Cold War imperatives dominated diplomatic agendas, resources allocated to historical justice diminished relative to those devoted to intelligence, alliance management, and economic recovery. Accountability became selective, reactive, and often dependent on external catalysts. Within Argentina, domestic considerations further shaped responses. Perón's government faced internal political challenges, economic pressures, and evolving relations with foreign powers. The presence of former German nationals did not constitute a central political issue. Where cases became unavoidable through media exposure or diplomatic crisis, responses were calibrated to manage fallout rather than to revise underlying policy frameworks. This approach persisted even after Perón's removal from power in 1955, as subsequent governments inherited the same legal and administrative structures. The reordering of priorities also influenced public memory. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, attention to Nazi crimes receded from daily political discourse in many countries, supplanted by concerns over communism and Reconstruction. The relative invisibility of fugitives in Latin America during this period contributed to later perceptions of neglect or complicity, even though contemporaneous actors operated within a different hierarchy of concerns. By the mid-1950s, the opportunity for comprehensive enforcement had largely passed. Individuals who had entered Argentina in the immediate post-war years were embedded within society. Evidence had grown stale, witnesses dispersed, and legal obstacles multiplied. Subsequent efforts to pursue accountability faced higher thresholds and greater political cost. The uneven outcomes that resulted were not anomalies, but predictable consequences of the international environment in which earlier decisions were made. This phase of the narrative underscores a central theme. The migration of German military officers and Nazi officials to Argentina cannot be understood without reference to the Cold War context that followed. The same structural conditions that facilitated movement, administrative discretion, legal sovereignty, and fragmented authority were reinforced by a geopolitical shift that deprioritized historical justice in favor of strategic stability. The cumulative effects of post-war migration, administrative discretion, and shifting international priorities can be measured only imperfectly. Any assessment of scale, composition, and distribution must contend with fragmentary records, inconsistent documentation, and deliberate concealment by some individuals. Nonetheless, a convergence of immigration files, shipping manifests, diplomatic correspondence, intelligence reports, and later judicial investigations permits a bounded reconstruction of the phenomenon. The evidence does not support claims of mass, centrally organized relocation, nor does it reduce the presence of perpetrators to isolated anomalies. What emerges is a limited but consequential migration whose contours are visible within the constraints of the archival record. Argentine immigration statistics provide the broadest quantitative frame. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, Argentina admitted several 100,000 European immigrants, reflecting long-standing demographic policy and post-war labor demand. Within this total, German nationals constituted a small fraction. Estimates drawn from the Direction Nacional de Migrations and corroborated by passenger lists indicate that several thousand German citizens entered Argentina during this period, with arrivals peaking between 1947 and 1950. These figures include family members, professionals, laborers, and former military personnel, and they encompass both permanent settlers and those who later moved elsewhere in Latin America. Disaggregating this population by wartime role is more complex. Immigration records did not classify entrants by former military or political affiliation. Retrospective categorization relies on cross-referencing names with Allied intelligence files, denazification records, court proceedings, and investigative journalism conducted decades later. Using these methods, historians generally agree that the majority of German migrants to Argentina after the war were civilians or former Wehrmacht personnel without specific criminal accusations. SS members and individuals implicated in crimes against humanity represented a minority, commonly estimated in the low hundreds. This proportional imbalance is significant. It indicates that the presence of high-profile perpetrators, while historically and morally consequential, did not define the overall character of German migration. The administrative systems that processed thousands of ordinary migrants did not distinguish systematically between categories. As a result, the same channels that facilitated routine immigration also enabled a smaller number of individuals to evade accountability. The scale of the latter group was limited, but their subsequent visibility distorted public perception of the whole. Shipping records offer partial corroboration. Passenger manifests from vessels arriving in Buenos Aires from Italian and Spanish ports list large numbers of European migrants traveling under temporary documents between 1946 and 1952. German names appear alongside Italian, Polish, Croatian, and other nationalities. These records rarely include information beyond name, age, occupation, and destination address. Where false identities were used, they are indistinguishable from genuine entries without external comparison. The utility of these records lies in establishing volume and timing rather than precise identification. Diplomatic archives add another layer. Correspondence between Argentine embassies and the foreign ministry acknowledges awareness that some German arrivals may have concealed their pasts. These acknowledgments are framed in general terms, reflecting the limits of available information rather than detailed knowledge of specific individuals. Where foreign governments supplied names or dossiers, Argentine responses varied, ranging from requests for additional documentation to assertions of legal insufficiency. The unevenness of this exchange underscores the absence of a comprehensive international tracking system. Intelligence files compiled by the United States and European services provide more granular detail, but are selective by design. They focus on individuals already suspected or identified, not on the broader migrant population. Declassified materials from the late 1940s and early 1950s show that Allied agencies were aware of Nazi fugitives in Latin America, including Argentina, but lacked reliable estimates of their number. Files were opened, closed, and reopened as information emerged, often years after initial migration. The existence of these files demonstrates awareness, not control. Judicial records from later decades further refine estimates. Trials, extradition proceedings, and investigations conducted from the late 1950s onward identified specific individuals who had resided in Argentina under assumed or real names. These cases provide concrete evidence of presence and, in some instances, of state knowledge at particular moments. However, they cannot be extrapolated mechanically to infer a larger hidden population. Each case reflects a convergence of discovery, political will, and legal feasibility that was not uniform. Archival gaps impose additional limits. Many European civil registries were destroyed during the war. Displaced persons files were not always preserved, and some were intentionally destroyed once resettlement was completed. In Argentina, immigration records from the period are incomplete, and access to security archives remains uneven. The use of aliases by some migrants further complicates reconstruction. These gaps are structural, not incidental, and they constrain the precision of any numerical claim. Historiographical consensus reflects these constraints. Serious scholarship avoids exact figures and emphasizes ranges and proportions. Claims of tens of thousands of Nazi fugitives in Argentina are unsupported by documentary evidence. Conversely, assertions that only a handful arrived minimize the documented presence of individuals implicated in serious crimes. The available evidence supports a middle position, a migration of several thousand German nationals, among whom a smaller but significant subset included SS members and Nazi officials who evaded prosecution. The temporal distribution of arrivals also matters. Most German migration to Argentina occurred in a relatively narrow window, roughly between 1946 and 1950. After 1952, arrivals declined as European reconstruction advanced, displacement diminished, and administrative controls tightened. This concentration reflects the convergence of post-war chaos, permissive immigration policy, and accessible routes described earlier. It also means that later discoveries relate to a cohort that had entered years earlier, not to ongoing inflows. Geographic distribution within Argentina followed established patterns. The majority of German migrants settled in Buenos Aires and its surrounding province, where employment opportunities and existing communities were concentrated. Others dispersed to industrial centers, agricultural regions, and provincial capitals. High-profile fugitives often chose anonymity over concentration, relocating periodically or settling in less prominent locales. These choices affected the likelihood of detection and later investigation. Comparative perspective further contextualizes scale. Argentina was not unique among receiving states. Brazil, Paraguay, Chile, and other countries in Latin America also admitted German migrants during the same period, including individuals later identified as Nazi fugitives. Western European countries, North America, and the Middle East similarly absorbed former German personnel, some of whom had compromised pasts. Argentina's significance lies in the visibility of certain cases and in the durability of settlement, not in numerical dominance. The question of numbers is therefore inseparable from the question of documentation. The post-war international system lacked the tools to track mass movement with precision. States prioritized reconstruction, sovereignty, and strategic alignment. Humanitarian agencies prioritized resettlement. Individuals exploited ambiguity where it existed. The archival record reflects these priorities and omissions. This reality has implications for interpretation. Quantification can illuminate patterns, but it cannot resolve questions of responsibility on its own. The presence of a limited number of perpetrators does not imply an intentional policy of sanctuary, nor does administrative normalization absolve institutions of the consequences of their actions. The scale was small relative to total migration, but the impact of individual cases was large. As the narrative approaches its final phase, the limits of the record become part of the story. The unevenness of documentation, the delay in discovery, and the persistence of uncertainty are not failures of historical method alone. They are products of the conditions under which post-war decisions were made and recorded. Understanding those limits is essential for assessing what could be known at the time, what was ignored, and what could only be reconstructed later. The partial and uneven nature of post-war accountability became most visible when the presence of former Nazi officials in Argentina began to surface publicly. This process did not unfold immediately after migration, nor did it follow a single institutional pathway. Exposure occurred gradually, driven by investigative journalism, survivor testimony, intelligence reassessment, and the actions of foreign governments. The responses that followed reveal the cumulative consequences of earlier administrative decisions, the constraints of international law, and the political calculations of states confronted with legacies they had not actively sought but had nonetheless accommodated. Public awareness began to sharpen in the late 1950s. By that time, the immediate pressures of post-war reconstruction had eased, and generational distance from the war allowed renewed attention to unresolved crimes. In West Germany, the establishment of the Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in 1958 marked a turning point. This institution coordinated investigations across federal states and reopened cases previously set aside. Its work generated new dossiers, witness statements, and arrest warrants, some of which implicated individuals believed to be living abroad. Parallel developments occurred elsewhere. Journalists and private researchers, often working independently of state institutions, traced wartime perpetrators through fragmentary records and personal networks. Survivors contributed testimony, sometimes decades after events, identifying names and locations. These efforts were uneven and labor-intensive, but they began to erode the anonymity that many former perpetrators had relied upon since leaving Europe. Argentina became a focal point of attention not because it hosted the largest number of fugitives, but because several prominent individuals were discovered there. The most consequential case involved Adolf Eichmann, a former SS officer who had played a central role in organizing the deportation of Jews to extermination camps. Eichmann entered Argentina in 1950 under the alias Ricardo Clement and lived in the Buenos Aires area for nearly a decade. His presence was known to some within expatriate circles, but it did not trigger official action. In May 1960, Israeli intelligence agents abducted Eichmann and transported him to Israel to stand trial. This operation, conducted without Argentine consent, provoked an international diplomatic crisis. Argentina lodged a formal protest with the United Nations, asserting a violation of sovereignty. The Security Council acknowledged the breach while affirming the gravity of Eichmann's crimes. The episode underscored the tension between legal process and moral urgency that had characterized post-war accountability from the outset. Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in 1961 had far-reaching effects. It recentered the Holocaust in global consciousness and demonstrated that perpetrators could be held accountable long after the fact. It also intensified scrutiny of countries perceived as havens for fugitives. Argentina, in particular, faced renewed international and domestic attention. Media investigations expanded, and previously obscure names entered public discourse. Other cases followed, though with less dramatic outcomes. Joseph Mengele, an SS physician associated with medical atrocities at Auschwitz, resided intermittently in Argentina during the 1950s before relocating to Paraguay and later Brazil. Despite periods of surveillance and diplomatic inquiry, he was never apprehended and died in Brazil in 1979. His case illustrates both the persistence of evasion and the limits of enforcement in the absence of sustained international cooperation. Judicial proceedings within Argentina were rare and constrained. Extradition requests submitted by European states were evaluated under domestic law, which required specific charges, evidentiary sufficiency, and judicial approval. In several instances, requests were delayed, withdrawn, or denied due to procedural deficiencies or statutes of limitation. Courts emphasized legality and due process, reflecting institutional continuity rather than indifference to crimes committed abroad. Political change altered but did not fundamentally transform this landscape. The overthrow of Juan Domingo Perón in 1955 introduced new leadership, but it did not produce a systematic reassessment of post-war immigration or residency decisions. Subsequent governments inherited administrative files and legal frameworks shaped by earlier choices. While cooperation with foreign investigations increased episodically, it remained reactive and case-specific. The differentiation among categories of German nationals persisted in this phase. Former Wehrmacht officers and civilian professionals were largely unaffected by renewed scrutiny, as few were accused of specific crimes. Their integration into Argentine society was by then complete, reinforced by long residence, employment, and in some cases citizenship. For SS personnel and high-ranking Nazi officials, exposure brought risk, but outcomes varied widely depending on timing, evidence, and political context. International law continued to impose constraints. The principle of non-retroactivity limited the application of newer legal standards to past acts. Universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity was not yet firmly established in practice. Extradition treaties differed in scope and interpretation. States remained the primary arbiters of enforcement, and their willingness to act reflected domestic priorities as much as moral considerations. The role of memory also evolved. In the 1960s and 1970s, public discourse increasingly emphasized historical responsibility and the rights of victims. This shift influenced policy indirectly, creating pressure for cooperation and transparency. Archives were opened incrementally, and historians gained access to materials previously restricted. These developments enabled a more systematic reconstruction of post-war migration and its consequences. Despite these advances, accountability remained incomplete. Many individuals implicated in crimes died before facing trial. Others lived under assumed identities without detection. The passage of time eroded evidence and witness availability, raising legal thresholds and limiting prosecutorial options. These outcomes were not the result of a single failure, but of cumulative decisions made under different conditions and priorities. Argentina's experience was not unique. Similar patterns unfolded in other countries that admitted post-war migrants. The uneven pursuit of justice reflected a broader international reality in which sovereignty, legal formalism, and geopolitical competition constrained action. The visibility of certain cases amplified perceptions of exceptionalism, but comparative analysis reveals structural commonalities. The long-term implications extend beyond individual prosecutions. The delayed exposure of fugitives prompted reassessment of post-war humanitarian and immigration practices. It raised questions about the balance between rapid resettlement and thorough vetting, about the limits of neutrality, and about the responsibilities of receiving states. These debates continue to inform contemporary discussions of asylum, migration, and accountability. As the narrative concludes, the central pattern comes into focus. The relocation of German military officers and Nazi officials to Argentina after the war resulted from identifiable historical conditions: displacement, administrative discretion, development priorities, and shifting international enforcement. Exposure and accountability, when they occurred, were shaped by those same conditions in reverse, constrained by time, law, and politics. The history does not resolve into a single judgment. It demonstrates how systems designed to restore order and facilitate recovery could also permit injustice to persist. It shows how individual agency intersected with institutional practice to produce outcomes neither fully intended nor wholly accidental. The record stands as a case study in the limits of post-war justice, grounded in evidence rather than myth, and sufficient in its complexity without embellishment. The historical record does not support a single, simplifying explanation for the post-war relocation of German military officers and Nazi officials to Argentina. What it reveals instead is a convergence of structural conditions, institutional practices, and individual decisions unfolding within a specific temporal window between 1945 and the mid-1950s. The The outcome was neither accidental nor centrally orchestrated. It was the predictable result of systems designed to manage collapse, recovery, and sovereignty operating under severe constraint. Europe emerged from the war fragmented administratively and physically displaced. Millions moved through provisional systems that prioritized survival, repatriation, and resettlement over retrospective adjudication. Identity verification was limited by destroyed records, overloaded institutions, and humanitarian urgency. These conditions created opportunities for movement that were available to a wide population, not solely to perpetrators. Within this environment, individuals with very different wartime roles passed through the same channels, differentiated only where specific information or political pressure intervened. Argentina's role was shaped by continuity rather than rupture. Long-standing immigration policy, executive discretion, and resistance to external interference predated 1945 and persisted afterward. The Perón government did not invent mechanisms to receive former Nazis, nor did it formally repudiate international norms of accountability. It applied domestic law as written, prioritized development and sovereignty, and declined to expand investigative mandates beyond existing frameworks. This approach facilitated entry and integration procedurally, without requiring ideological alignment or centralized intent. The state's behavior was characterized by awareness managed through fragmentation. Consular officials issued visas based on formal admissibility. Immigration authorities processed arrivals according to the documentation presented. Security services focused on domestic political stability rather than foreign crimes. Courts evaluated extradition requests narrowly, emphasizing legality and evidence. No single institution possessed a complete picture, and no mechanism existed to compel synthesis. Facilitation emerged from the interaction of these parts, not from a directive imposed from above. Individual agency operated within these constraints. Former Wehrmacht officers, largely shielded from prosecution absent specific allegations, migrated openly and integrated rapidly. Civilian officials associated with the Nazi state navigated ambiguity, often emphasizing technical roles and professional continuity. SS personnel and high-risk perpetrators relied on concealment, false identities, and intermediaries, exploiting the same administrative gaps that served broader humanitarian ends. Their successful evasion was uneven, contingent, and never guaranteed. International enforcement priorities evolved in ways that compounded these outcomes. The early focus on European trials narrowed geographically and hierarchically. As Cold War imperatives took precedence, resources and attention shifted toward reconstruction, alliance management, and intelligence competition. Accountability did not disappear, but it became selective, reactive, and often delayed. States retained discretion, and few mechanisms existed to compel sustained pursuit across borders. The scale of the phenomenon reflects these dynamics. Several thousand German nationals entered Argentina in the post-war period. The majority were civilians and former soldiers without specific criminal charges. A smaller subset, numbering in the low hundreds, included SS members and Nazi officials implicated in crimes. Their later prominence in public memory has obscured proportionality without negating responsibility. The historical impact of individual cases was large, even where their numerical weight was limited. Exposure, when it came, underscored the consequences of earlier decisions. Investigative journalism, survivor testimony, and renewed legal efforts revealed how deeply administrative normalization had embedded individuals within new societies. Arrests and trials in later decades demonstrated that time did not extinguish guilt, but they also revealed how law, sovereignty, and evidentiary decay constrained justice. Outcomes were uneven because the systems that produced them had been uneven from the start. This history does not lend itself to absolution or indictment by slogan. It shows how humanitarian imperatives can coexist with moral failure, how legal formalism can enable injustice without endorsing it, and how sovereignty can shield both legitimate governance and its unintended consequences. It demonstrates that post-war recovery was achieved not through perfect justice, but through compromise, prioritization, and omission. The relocation of German military officers and Nazi officials to Argentina was not a myth of secret empires or hidden commands. It was a documented historical process shaped by identifiable policies, institutional limits, and geopolitical shifts. Its legacy lies not only in the lives of those who escaped accountability, but in the lessons it offers about the boundaries of law and morality in periods of systemic collapse. The record is sufficient without exaggeration. It shows how history advances not through coherence, but through accumulation of decisions, constraints, and consequences. Understanding that accumulation is essential, not to close the past, but to recognize how easily unresolved justice can become normalized when the demands of the present outweigh the claims of the past.